When Karoline Leavitt sued the media, they laughed at first. But when the evidence came out, they begged her to stop. The air inside the studio was heavy, not with smoke or sound, but with a tense and suffocating silence. The cameras were already rolling, and the crew stood still, waiting anxiously for their host to speak. Karoline took a deep, purposeful breath, the kind that signaled something big was about to happen, something no one saw coming. Then, leaning forward and gripping the desk a bit too tightly, she did the unthinkable. "Karoline, please, I'm asking you to end this lawsuit, for everyone's sake." The host's words came out shakier than she intended, but there was no way to take them back or soften the blow. This host, a woman known for her bold opinions and relentless criticism of conservative figures, was doing something she never thought she'd have to do, pleading with Karoline on live television, someone she had once called a threat to democracy. The lawsuit had hit the world of political media like an earthquake. $800 million. That wasn't just a number. It was a death sentence for careers, networks, and legacies. Karoline Leavitt had sued for defamation, pulling some of the most powerful names in news into a legal fight that had already burned through millions in legal fees alone. At first, some had shrugged it off as just a political stunt, but now it had turned into something far more serious. This wasn't about words anymore, it was about survival. And tonight, with every second that passed, the desperation in the host's voice was becoming more obvious. "This isn't about ideology anymore," she continued, her hands moving as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. "It's about the damage this is doing to our entire industry, to the people who bring information to the public, to the very idea of a free press." It was a strange moment, not because of what she was saying, but because of who was saying it. Just months ago, she had been leading the charge with the very rhetoric that had helped fuel the lawsuit. She had taken her shots, she had made her points, and had truly believed she was on the right side of history. But now, sitting under the harsh studio lights, she wasn't so sure anymore. The lawsuit wasn't just a legal issue. It had become a wrecking ball, tearing through relationships, professional alliances, and the very foundation of trust that held major networks together. Reporters had already lost their jobs, and executives were being pushed into secret meetings behind closed doors, desperately trying to contain the damage. Worst of all, the viewers were watching every bit of it. Ratings had skyrocketed, not because people cared about the truth, but because they were watching a slow-motion train wreck. Some wanted revenge, others wanted to see justice served, and everyone had chosen a side. There was no middle ground left. The host swallowed hard. There was a reason she was saying all this now, at this very moment, when everything was hanging by a thread. The lawsuit was closer than ever to reaching the courtroom. Something had changed. She had seen things, heard things, whispers about what might happen next, and about what certain powerful people were willing to do to protect themselves. Because, in the end, that's what this was really about, wasn't it? Power. The lawsuit was no longer about what was said, or even about who was right. It had become a fight for leverage and control. And now, here she was, a woman who had spent years building her reputation on never bowing down, staring into the camera and pleading. "You don't have to prove anything, Karoline. You've already won. People are scared. You've made your point." She let the silence hang for a moment, hoping it would make a difference. But hope wasn't enough anymore, and the real battle was just beginning. What had changed behind the scenes to make her shift her stance so drastically? The lawsuit had started like so many others, with loud headlines, bold claims, and legal analysts breaking down every detail on cable news. At first, it seemed like just another case in the never-ending battle between politicians and the media. This time, it was different. Karoline Leavitt wasn't suing over a misquote or an exaggerated claim. She was going after everything. The networks, the executives, the hosts, the journalists, and the money that kept the whole machine running. $800 million. That wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a death sentence for an entire industry. It all traced back to a single moment. A panel discussion broadcast live 6 months ago, where a group of journalists, including the host now pleading for peace, had openly speculated about Leavitt's alleged involvement in something they couldn't prove. No solid evidence, no airtight sources, just whispers and rumors repeated enough times to start sounding like the truth. Leavitt, young but politically ruthless, had been watching. She knew exactly what unchecked media narratives could do, and this time she wasn't going to let it slide. She struck back, hard. Her legal team was relentless, filing lawsuits not just against one network, but against multiple outlets, journalists, and producers. Emails were subpoenaed, phone records were pulled, even internal Slack messages were dragged into the spotlight. It turned ugly fast. Journalists who had once mocked her were suddenly silent, realizing just how deep this cut could go. The journalists targeted by the lawsuit were now being forced to delete old tweets. Some had gone completely silent, disappearing from social media as if they had never existed. Behind the scenes, there was panic. Executives were holding emergency meetings and legal teams were frantically searching for a way out. Some networks had already started to distance themselves from their own people, releasing half-hearted statements about their commitment to integrity while quietly preparing severance packages. But Leavitt wasn't backing down. She didn't want retractions or apologies, she wanted payback. And the worst part was, she had the upper hand. Her legal team had secured something big, something the networks weren't ready to fight against. Proof. Documents, recordings, internal memos showing that behind closed doors, even some of the most trusted names in journalism knew they had been reckless. They had pushed a narrative because it fit what they wanted to believe, and now it was too late to take it back. The media had underestimated her. They had assumed she would fade away under the pressure, but they couldn't have been more wrong. They had assumed she would just take the hits, issue a statement, express her outrage, and then move on, just like so many others before her. But Leavitt wasn't just another politician. She was young, ambitious, and dangerous in a way that many had failed to see. She understood something most politicians never did: how to play the game. She wasn't suing just for the money. She was suing to make a point, to remind them all that they weren't untouchable, that no one, no matter how powerful, could manipulate a narrative without facing consequences. As the case moved closer to trial, the fear was becoming real. Whispers had turned into frantic phone calls, and journalists who had once laughed off the lawsuit were now scrambling for lawyers. Some were even negotiating secret settlements, hoping to escape before the worst of it hit. And then there was the host, the woman who had spent years building her career on being fearless and unshakable. Now she was pleading, not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. She wasn't pleading because she believed in peace or thought Leavitt was right. She was pleading because she had seen what was coming next. If this lawsuit went all the way to trial, it wouldn't just be about one case. It would change everything. But what exactly had been uncovered that made the media so desperate to stop this lawsuit in its tracks? It started as a rumor, a whisper from a source who didn't want to be named. At first, no one believed it. There was no way Karoline Leavitt's legal team had gotten their hands on something that could bring an entire media empire to its knees. Then one night, an anonymous email landed in the inbox of a senior producer at one of the networks being sued. The subject line was simple: "You need to see this." Attached was an audio recording. The producer clicked play, and what they heard was worse than anything they had imagined. A private conversation, not a public panel or a recorded interview, but a behind-the-scenes discussion between senior executives, lead anchors, and political strategists. And they weren't just discussing Karoline Leavitt, they were orchestrating the coverage, coordinating narratives, deciding in real time how to shape public perception, not based on facts, but on strategy. The voices on the recording were unmistakable, and the implications were devastating. The voices on the tape were unmistakable. One of them, a high-profile journalist, could be heard saying, "Look, it doesn't matter if we can't prove it. We just have to make people doubt her. That's enough." Another, a network executive, responded, "If we say it enough times, it becomes reality. She won't survive it." Then came the part that sent chills down the spine of every legal team who heard it. A third voice, one of the most respected names in the industry, stated plainly, "We'll bury her. And if it turns out we're wrong, we'll just move on like we always do." The producer listening to the tape froze. This wasn't just bias or reckless journalism. This was intent. This was proof that behind closed doors, some of the most powerful names in media weren't just reporting the news, they were crafting weapons. And the worst part? Leavitt's team had the recording. It had been leaked to them by someone on the inside, and now it was evidence, not just for the lawsuit, but for something much bigger. Suddenly, everything changed. Lawyers who had been planning to fight Leavitt in court were backpedaling. Networks that had spent months dismissing her lawsuit as frivolous were now scrambling to contain the fallout. The damage was unthinkable because if that recording made it into a courtroom, it wouldn't just be one lawsuit anymore. It would mean the end of reputations, careers, entire networks. The power brokers of political media had always operated under one assumption that no matter what happened, they would be protected. That even if they got caught, the news cycle would eventually move on. But this time, there was no moving on. The industry was bleeding, and Leavitt had the knife. And now the host, the woman who had spent her career fighting against everything Leavitt stood for, was begging her to put the knife down. Not for justice, not for truth, but for survival. Because if Leavitt didn't stop now, the media's worst nightmare was about to become reality. But what would happen if she refused? And who was really pulling the strings behind the scenes? The moment that recording surfaced, behind closed doors, the power players in media and politics knew they had a crisis on their hands. But in the halls of corporate newsrooms and political offices, panic wasn't an option. Decisions had to be made fast. Some wanted to fight. They argued that the recording could be discredited, dismissed, spun into a conspiracy. After all, the media had survived worse. There were always ways to twist a story, ways to turn even the ugliest truths into something more palatable. The most damning evidence could be spun into misinformation, or at least that's what some believed. But others saw the writing on the wall. This wasn't just about Karoline Leavitt anymore. It was about control. If this lawsuit went to trial, if the recording was played in court, the damage wouldn't stop at just one network. It would rip through every major news outlet that had ever done the same, pushing narratives, manipulating stories, protecting the right people while destroying those who threatened their influence. So the real discussions, the ones that mattered, were happening far from the cameras, in closed-door meetings at the highest levels of media and politics. The biggest names in news were making phone calls they never thought they'd have to make, asking the same desperate question. How do we make this go away? The answer: pressure. Karoline Leavitt was already under public scrutiny, young, ambitious, and, as far as they were concerned, dangerous. But even the most powerful people in the country had underestimated her. Leavitt wasn't backing down. She wasn't taking the money. She wasn't playing their game. She had one goal: exposure. She wanted the world to see just how deep the corruption went. The rot ran deep, and the more they pushed, the more determined Leavitt became. So they switched tactics. If Leavitt couldn't be bought or threatened into submission, they had to find another way to stop her. That's when the whispers began. Leaks started appearing online, headlines shifting the focus, stories about Leavitt's past, her personal life, her finances. Nothing was off limits. They were building a counterattack, and leading that charge was the same host who was now begging her to back down. For months, the host had been one of the loudest voices against Leavitt, and for a while she had believed every word of it. The stories, the allegations, the narratives. But now she wasn't so sure. Because behind the scenes, she had seen who was really calling the shots, and suddenly she realized she wasn't a journalist anymore. She was a pawn, a tool being used to take down someone who had gotten too close to the truth. And yet, even now, she wasn't sure if she wanted Leavitt to win. Because if Leavitt won, everything would change. The networks, the institutions, the people who had built their careers on controlling the narrative, they wouldn't survive it. So, as she sat in that chair under the bright studio lights, pleading for an end to the chaos, she wasn't just fighting for the industry, she was fighting for herself. The host wasn't just pleading for an end to the lawsuit for herself, she was speaking for all of them. For every journalist who had ever taken orders, for every executive who had ever killed a story to protect the wrong people, for every name that wouldn't survive what came next. But the question remained: who had leaked the recording and why? Not many people had access to that recording. It wasn't something you could just stumble upon. Someone on the inside had made a choice. And now, in a world where every move was calculated, where narratives were shaped behind closed doors, one person had decided to burn it all down. The media world was built on silence, on unspoken agreements, on the understanding that no one turned against the machine. Yet someone had. The moment the tape was leaked, the speculation started. Who did it? A rogue producer? A disgruntled journalist? A political operative who had finally grown a conscience? Theories swirled, but no one had answers. At least not at first. But behind the scenes, the networks had already begun their own investigation. And what they found shook them to the core. The leak hadn't come from a low-level employee. It had come from someone at the top. A seasoned executive, a person who had spent years building the very empire that was now crumbling, the very system that now stood on the verge of collapse. And the reason? Guilt. For years, they had watched stories get twisted, seen how the truth was shaped, how reality was manufactured. And at some point, it had become too much. So they made a decision, a quiet one, a dangerous one. They copied the recording. They waited. And when the lawsuit reached its boiling point, when they realized no one was going to do the right thing, they sent the email. They made sure the world would know. But now time was running out. The networks were closing in. The executives were furious. Because this wasn't just betrayal, this was an act of war. Someone had turned against the system, and the system wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. Meanwhile, Leavitt's legal team had seized the opportunity. The recording was now their weapon, and with it, they weren't just going after one news network anymore, they were going after all of them. This was no longer just a lawsuit, it was a reckoning. And for the first time, the people who had always controlled the story, they were the ones losing control, the ones losing control. But with so much power at stake, how far would the media go to protect itself? When people in power start losing control, they don't go down quietly, they fight. And now, with Karoline Leavitt refusing to settle and the leaked recording threatening to expose more than just one network's dirty tactics, the media machine was in full survival mode. They couldn't let this case make it to trial because if it did, the consequences wouldn't just be financial, it would be an extinction-level event. Major news executives were already making their calls. Lobbyists, political strategists, lawyers, damage control had begun. The plan was simple: turn the tide. If they couldn't pressure Leavitt into backing down, they had to destroy her credibility before she had the chance to step into a courtroom. And so, the headlines started changing. New scandals emerged, old financial records were suddenly discovered, and a former acquaintance came forward with accusations. Even a distant relative, someone Leavitt hadn't spoken to in years, was dragged into the spotlight. The goal was clear: bury Leavitt before she could bury them. The public had never heard of appeared in an interview with shocking new claims about her character. The message was clear. Karoline Leavitt was dangerous, untrustworthy, reckless. The same media that had painted her as an irrelevant figure just months before was now calling her the biggest threat to democracy since the invention of propaganda itself. And yet, through it all, Leavitt didn't blink. She didn't hold press conferences. She didn't release emotional statements. She just kept quiet, because she knew something they didn't. She knew that for every smear article, for every desperate attempt to discredit her, more people were waking up. More people were starting to ask the question they weren't supposed to ask. If the media is telling me to hate her this much, what are they afraid of? But the media wasn't just afraid, they were desperate, and desperate people do reckless things. That's why, behind the scenes, the real pressure campaign had begun. Phone calls to Leavitt's legal team, to her family. Warnings, veiled threats, promises that things could go away if she just walked away. But Leavitt wasn't walking away. She was doubling down. Her lawyers were preparing for the fight of a lifetime, the very fabric of the free press. But Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She watched the broadcast in silence, the host's plea echoing through the room, her voice trembling just enough to seem sincere. The network had done its job well, framing the lawsuit as an existential threat and painting Leavitt as a reckless force determined to dismantle the media industry. The teleprompter-fed words were smooth, rehearsed, designed to sway public opinion. But Leavitt saw through it all. She knew this wasn't about protecting journalism or preserving the truth. It was about power, about maintaining control. The trial of a lifetime was approaching, and Leavitt was ready to take the stand, knowing that once that recording was played in court, the world would finally see the truth. The media's last-ditch effort was unraveling, and the host, once so confident in her convictions, was now a pawn in a game spiraling out of control. The real question was no longer whether Leavitt would hold her ground, but what her next move would be, and whether it would be something no one expected. The entire display was a calculated performance, but Leavitt saw it for what it truly was, words laced with fear, not sincerity. The host's plea wasn't for justice, it was a desperate bid for self-preservation. Leavitt understood the gravity of the moment, realizing that her next move would not only seal the fate of her lawsuit, but also determine if those who had manipulated the narrative for years would finally face consequences. Her legal team had warned her that if she pushed for trial, they would unleash everything they had. The threats, the false accusations, the sudden investigations, every tactic meant to bury her in silence, but silence was no longer an option. With the truth so close to being revealed, Leavitt switched off the TV, drew in a steady breath, and made her decision. She picked up the phone and called her attorney. "We go to trial," she said firmly. In that moment, the networks knew their worst nightmare was about to unfold. The public had never heard of appeared in an interview with shocking new claims about her character. The message was clear. Karoline Leavitt was dangerous, untrustworthy, reckless. The same media that had painted her as an irrelevant figure, just months before, was now calling her the biggest threat to democracy since the invention of propaganda itself. And yet, through it all, Leavitt didn't blink. She didn't hold press conferences, she didn't release emotional statements, she just kept quiet. Because she knew something they didn't. She knew that for every smear article, for every desperate attempt to discredit her, more people were waking up. More people were starting to ask the question they weren't supposed to ask. If the media is telling me to hate her this much, what are they afraid of? But the media wasn't just afraid, they were desperate, and desperate people do reckless things. That's why, behind the scenes, the real pressure campaign had begun. Phone calls to Leavitt's legal team, to her family, warnings, veiled threats, promises that things could go away if she just walked away. But Leavitt wasn't walking away. She was doubling down. Her lawyers were preparing for the fight of a lifetime, the very fabric of the free press. But Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She watched the broadcast in silence, the host's plea echoing through the room, her voice trembling just enough to seem sincere. The network had done its job well, framing the lawsuit as an existential threat and painting Leavitt as a reckless force determined to dismantle the media industry. The teleprompter-fed words were smooth, rehearsed, designed to sway public opinion, but Leavitt saw through it all. She knew this wasn't about protecting journalism or preserving the truth. It was about power, about maintaining control. The trial of a lifetime was approaching, and Leavitt was ready to take the stand, knowing that once that recording was played in court, the world would finally see the truth. The media's last-ditch effort was unraveling, and the host, once so confident in her convictions, was now a pawn in a game spiraling out of control. The real question was no longer whether Leavitt would hold her ground, but what her next move would be, and whether it would be something no one expected. The entire display was a calculated performance, but Leavitt saw it for what it truly was. Words laced with fear, not sincerity. The host's plea wasn't for justice, it was a desperate bid for self-preservation. Leavitt understood the gravity of the moment, realizing that her next move would not only seal the fate of her lawsuit, but also determine if those who had manipulated the narrative for years would finally face consequences. Her legal team had warned her that if she pushed for trial, they would unleash everything they had. The threats, the false accusations, the sudden investigations, every tactic meant to bury her in silence. But silence was no longer an option. With the truth so close to being revealed, Leavitt switched off the TV, drew in a steady breath, and made her decision. She picked up the phone and called her attorney. "We go to trial," she said firmly. In that moment, the networks knew their worst nightmare was about to unfold.